If you have the right cultural fabric to keep thinking that I have to simplify, if it's 10 steps, I have to get it to 5 steps, but you can only do that if there's out of the 8 to 10 people, they all understand the value. If you're the one or two designer or a PM trying to do that and the engineers don't really get it, they can't empathize with it, it's hard. So that's the biggest thing that I found is any group that has a high degree of empathy for simplification is directly proportional to how effective you are in simplifying the next step.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Zero to Exit. This is Ankur and Nilima. In today's show, we're excited to have with us Sunil Potti, a VP and GM for Google Cloud Security Business. Prior to Google, Sunil was the CPO at Nutanix, a leader in hyperconverged infrastructure. He also held product leadership roles at Citrix, F5, Cisco, and others. Sunil is what I call the billion-dollar PM. He has consistently led market-leading products, is a master of scale. In this episode, we'll talk about how to consistently find the right company to work for, how to land the top role, and how to build, scale, and sell great products. Hey, Sunil, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Ankur and Nilima. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I know it's busy season for you and Google and everybody, but we really appreciate you taking the time. I want to kick things off by asking you kind of what's been the biggest surprise for you in the last 1 year, either personally or professionally?
I would say that interestingly, it's probably something that touches both profession and I think personal in the sense, clearly it has to, at least I'm not different than most folks where the pandemic is really top of mind, but I actually really dig working from home. And the reason why it's surprising is I'm what people think is a highly extroverted social person. Yeah. I like hanging out with people, hanging out with teams, have meetings, go out, bond with folks and so forth. For someone like that, clearly there was the initial, personally, as well as with some colleagues and others, like, oh, this is going to be pretty tough for folks like you. And I think I was able to kind of get away earlier on when things were a little bit open to kind of get the bursts of meeting folks outside and so forth. But what actually turned out to be the case is that to me personally is like, I really love working from home, just taking walks, making calls. And in many ways, I am way more productive than being 5-10 minutes late to a meeting constantly and having to show up in a conference room. And then there's 4 of the 10 people are anyway remote, the usual things that we're all, stressed out about the commute and all, right? So in many ways, I think both professionally and personally, I think I'm looking forward to the fact that there's probably zero chance that most companies will go back to the usual way of working. Yeah. I'm sure the next 6 to 12 months will be an experiment. At least in Google, we're definitely going to do a couple of experiments. And personally, I'm looking forward to like this sort of like new way of working that'll also impact my personal life and my professional life. So.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I often talk about this in the podcast as well. Like I've never worked from home ever, and then like last 1 year has been a revelation. It's actually everything is fine. I mean, you're more productive and get to spend more time with the family. I thought you were going to say your biggest surprise is that you would have never thought 1 in a million year that this artist called Beeple is going to sell an art for $68 million over an NFT on a blockchain.
Yeah, I guess there's many surprises, frankly, put it this way, over the last year, right? So.
Yeah. So I'll pivot to your career a bit, Sunil. As I look at your career from Cisco, F5, Citrix, Nutanix, and now Google, you've been at the right company at the right time. How did you manage to consistently bet on the right horse?
Yeah, I know we talked a little bit about this before, Nilima and Ankur. See, my take is actually in many ways, what might look like a good trajectory is all relative, right? It could have been much better depending on the opportunities I didn't take, as well as obviously, much worse. If I look at it as an optimistic lens, I would say that 15 years ago, like most folks, probably in their early part of their career and so forth, reasonably aggressive about outcomes, growth, and all that usual stuff. One thing I was pretty clear about even then was I don't think, now I know, but at that point I was pretty clear that I wasn't an entrepreneur who would actually go found things. Okay. And, if you watch the movie Enter the Dragon, there's this guy called John Saxon. And there's this very famous line that he uses called, the scene is like, you have to go fight Bruce Lee, and both of them are good people. And this guy goes, look, I'm a man that knows my limitations. So I think, so one of the things to sort of think through your career trajectory is not what just you can do, but what you can't do also, in my opinion. And that's hard when you're, younger and aggressive and ambitious and, all that stuff, right? So for me, I think the optimistic thing is that earlier in my life, I missed out on some opportunities. I just say that I could have been like, say, an engineering lead in one of our larger social media companies in 2006. But then I was enamored by being a director at Cisco, one of the younger guys, and why would I go and take another job at some other company that was much smaller, right? So after I missed on some of those opportunities, very very quickly I started optimizing for the opportunity than the role. And many folks figure this out, but earlier in your careers, normally to kind of make that trade-off is very hard, because you're sort of like gifted with roles and more increasing responsibility, and to kind of take a step down to kind of be a smaller fish in a 10x larger pond is much harder when you're younger. And so that's probably one of the core things that probably helped me, was that partly I knew I wasn't one of these entrepreneurs who just wanted to kind of go big and all that. I could build stuff, I could scale stuff, but entrepreneuring, as you all know, is different. And the second thing that I learned, but probably a little later, maybe not early, but mid-stage, is the fact to optimize for the opportunity, not the role. And that's really what happened. Was when NetScaler came on after F5, it was similar, but really what I looked at was, rather than look at the enterprise opportunity, how would we actually go after, coming from behind, because in Citrix, NetScaler was like a stepchild to some extent. And all large companies, they have the saying, right? When you have a multi-product company, you can't teach the sales guy new tricks when they're making quota on their old tricks. Yeah. And as long as the primary product is making money, it's pretty hard to grow a second business. That's one of the fundamental reasons why people acquire companies, right? So, yeah. But in the case of NetScaler, what happened was that, at least when I was at F5 and others, I could see how F5 was so enamored by the enterprise that there was this emerging opportunity at that time, this is 2009, that people didn't really pay attention to things called cloud, because there wasn't something called cloud. And there was all this growth happening on all these startups using Amazon at that time, right? So, and obviously all that build required a scalable infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as there was an instinct or an idea to kind of look at the opportunity being different, the role was pretty similar, frankly, between F5 and Citrix. It's just that because the opportunity was different, the impact or the outcome, spending 3 years at Citrix, was not 2x more than F5. It was more like 5x more than F5, because the outcome went from whatever, $50, $100 million to $1 billion business and so forth, right? So I would say that, let me pause there, and I'm sure there's probably questions, but it's really the pivot on opportunity versus role. I think the earlier in life that folks do, I think the better off they are.
So one of the things I was going to ask you later on, but like one of the things that as we've read more about you, is like looking around the corners for opportunities. So let's say, you're doing really well in one company. For you to be able to see what the future is starting to look, right? Like what just recently, what Coinbase founders saw, a lot of people didn't see that. How do you look around the corners individually, not just in product decision, but when you think about career, and we want some practical advice for our listeners, like, you're working in a company, good 20-30% year over year business, but there's a big paradigm shift happening elsewhere. How do you seize those moments?
Yeah. No, man, it's hard. I mean, frankly, it's even with Coinbase, for example, right? Yeah. 2 years ago, and the company is what, a dozen years old or something like that now, right? It's not Clubhouse.
Yes.
2 years ago, I don't know if people would have said, oh yeah, Coinbase, right? So that means that they've been doing it for like 7-8 years without the world recognizing that there was actually a corner that was turned, right? There is no, at least my personal take on something like this is, I'm good, but not great at being extremely curious. And so you can only look around corners when rather than look for opportunities, look for people who constantly want to do that. And you curate your relationships to at least have a few people like that. Obviously they're not normal people in a normal situation, but And you'd be surprised how many times the turning around corners is not as much as looking around something. It's to actually follow the instincts of people who are extremely curious. And then it's up to you as a person to kind of connect the dots a little bit, obviously do some testing, and then, put some filters on it, get some signal from the noise. Because for the extremely curious people, there's also a reasonable degree of noise, in my opinion, just because their personalities are like that. So if you're like one step removed, that I think, in my opinion, is the art, is the one step removed from that extreme curiosity, which allows you to bring a level of balance, but still being leaning in around being open to what's actually going on. Why are these folks doing this? Why is somebody talking about this area? Right. And that allows you to kind of then lean in to learn more, and then you go do your connection with God. So in summary, I would say that when people are talking, like in the world of security right now, a lot of people like are talking about governance and regulations because of Cloud Act, the local California Act, or European, shrimps to regulation. I'm now getting into some, security related stuff. But when you see those themes emerging, and the nationalistic regimes are actually locking in post Trump, then you know that there's probably a new era of
So
governance
interesting.
emerging.
Yeah.
Because once you go there, they're not going to come back, right? It's like China, basically. Once they became nationalistic and they're going to build stuff internally, the rest of the folks have a role model to kind of just say, let me go on. So anyway, just as an example.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned a management concept that I've been reading. Start from doing to leading, and that's more of a management thing. But what you're saying is, when you're following the ideas, follow the people who are kind of
Correct.
curating
Correct.
the
Correct.
curious ideas, and then focus on one theme and then go after it, basically.
Yeah. Interesting point of view. I just don't know whether, it's sound enough. But generally, it's not even a fast follower type. It's there's this art of being not the first person off the door, but but just being that really close second, just so that you have the option to come back, or the option, but you don't lose the opportunity to go all in, if it makes sense. Yeah, and that's a little bit of an art, and that's what people talk about as timing, right, quote unquote, to some extent.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, you minimize the risk because the first person walking in that door is the entrepreneur, which is either committing a suicide or going to make $20 billion like the Coinbase CEO did.
yeah.
But if you're the second guy, you're still, ending up with a
Yeah,
big
that's what I'm saying.
payoff.
It depends on the personalities and all that. That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying. Is
yeah,
that I think
yeah,
if you're a product person, or a normal, like if you're going down your normal stuff, I think maybe something like that makes sense. But if you have a chip on your shoulder, you want to run your own company, and this is the only way you want to grow and all that, you'll have no problem being the first person out of the door.
And one point that you mentioned is, it's so important to also know that what you're not going to do. Little practical examples there. How do you kind of evolve that decision tree?
There's things in that dimension that apply to your career, as I mentioned, right? Whether
Mhm.
to just because you became successful, and then there's a constant set of VCs that will always go to you, and then you'll find that it's quite enamoring to kind of go build something just because there's money available, right? A lot of people do that, as we know, and these days especially, there's a lot more money available. So I think on the career side, there's quite a bit of that I think, again, there's nothing wrong in trying it out. It's just that at some point soon in your life, if you can learn to ensure that, look, just because things are available doesn't mean you should do them. So this is where you just have to kind of really have a filter on, is this the right thing for you? Are you willing to kind of go the distance? And
Hmm.
that's what I meant by entrepreneuring versus joining something series B or something like that. And there's no harm and foul as long as you're authentic about it, right?
Yeah.
And most companies actually prefer authentic leaders who sort of like, hey, look, could I have done a decent job in the founding team? Probably. But if things went sour and all, was that something that I would wake up in the morning and really care for? Probably not me, right? But there are a lot of other people like that, right? So just an example of knowing what your limitations are. Similarly, I would say on your independent of a career side, even in product journeys, even in personal lives and all, I think, like, we talk about product scaling all the time, right? And we
yeah.
talk about product market fit. The whole definition of product market fit is to accept what your product cannot do.
Yes.
Most folks who are in the ambition of building products, you'd be surprised how many people don't apply that filter, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, because the easy way to define product market fit is to give a big market.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about product growth. Actually, that's going to the product pieces, because that's kind of really the main thing we want to discuss. But before we get there, I do want to kind of segue into the next section, which is, it's hard enough to find the right horse to bet on. It's even harder to be the top jock riding that horse. You've been the top jock in a lot of the, at least, especially the last 4 or 5 companies, and managed to land the top product role at least, right? I'd love for you to sort of talk about some of the core principles that has led you to land that role. I think what sort of a lot of people don't recognize is, people are like, well, if I work hard enough and I learn enough, the universe will give me the top role. And one of the things I've learned is that that's maybe foundational or not even that important. What have you learned along your journey to kind of got you in the position that you have been consistently in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this obviously in itself is a long discussion that will
It
require a
is.
lot to cover everything. But
Yeah.
I'll tell you a few things that come to mind. Look, first of all, look, yeah, was I a top product guy? Maybe at Nutanix, and ironically, like at Google, I'm not the top product guy, or
Yeah, of course.
Citrix. Yeah, these are all relevant roles, but maybe not the
Yes.
top role, right? But the spirit of the question is,
Yes.
like, how do you chart that trajectory, both
Yes.
on opportunity and role? Like,
Yes.
remember, like 5 minutes ago, we talked about optimize for opportunity.
Opportunity.
Yeah,
Yes.
but can you do both? Then you get a force
Yes.
multiplier, right? Opportunity
Yes.
times
Yeah.
role
Yes.
is where you're done, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about that for a second. So I think if you do well and you're able to kind of have those instincts of looking around corners and a few things, remember I was talking about following people, looking, in addition to doing great job executing as part of the course, then you'll be able to sense when opportunity is opening up and you're putting those filters to kind of be in the first 15% that recognizes that opportunity. Yeah. So that gets you in the game, because if you're in the first 15%, the chances of you being set up to do a good role is way higher than being in the 50 percentile, right? Just because by that time, either the person already there would have grown, or, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way to get opportunity times role, is to be in the first 15% of an opportunity that you look at.
Yeah.
You don't have to be in the first 1%, which is the founding team, but the first 15% or so. Yeah. And then as long as the opportunity is scaling, your role automatically gets to the top. And there are many,
Yeah.
many folks like that we've seen, right? So that's your what I would call the standard technique, is optimize for opportunity, but make sure that you're not too hesitant. As in, like, you're not 1%, but you're not like, don't wait for Series F.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're in between A and B, or equivalent of that. And that, by the way, that applies not just to small companies, that applies to big companies too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when there's a new product initiative, the early maybe 1 2 things are harder, but once it gets going, if I'm an engineer, if I'm a product person, and so forth, sort of like being the person that maybe was the second person beyond the GM to kind of help define that new product area inside my NewCo and write that to 50 million, 100 million, whatever it is, then defines you, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way to get the opportunity times role. The second way, which is much more elusive and probably much more elitist, and to some extent, hopefully folks all get to that, is where not only is the opportunity well known and waiting, but the role is opened up for someone. Like, you could argue that the larger the opportunity or the better the opportunity, the bigger the roles, the big roles are not as open anymore, either because they're already taken and so forth. But then you see this all the time, right? I mean, with
Yeah.
Snowflake, with Slootman being brought in as CEO and all, right?
Yeah.
So you see this with CEO jobs. You'd be surprised that it also happens with product jobs. It definitely happens with sales jobs and so forth. So that's when I think that's a little limited, just because that you're talking about maybe 10, 20 people per year that are in that category. But at some point, if you can get to be that 10 or 20 people per year in a certain segment, then that's another way to maximize opportunity times. So, and what I meant by that is, just to kind of put things in perspective, right? Is imagine a Series D company, you're going to go public in a year or two, and highly likely you normally look for a head of sales or a CFO. CFO most of the time, maybe a head of sales. Yeah. Very few times they look for a head of product or engineering or things like that, unless something's broken, right? At that point in time, they'll scour the valley and look for 10, 20 people. to choose from. Essentially, what based on whatever work you've done, they're giving you that opportunity times role because they want that expertise. And so that is something that is earned by a whole bunch of things that you've done in your past lives to for them to actually have given you that opportunity, right? So
Got
anyway,
it.
those are the two things. Basically, go
Yeah.
early, but not too early, but go in the 15%, and then or do enough, which is what we can get into the details as to what are all the things that allow you to be recruited in Series D and F as a CPO. So
Got it. So that's a really good practical advice to sort of land the top role to begin with. A lot of people have sort of are curious also about you are organically moving within an organization, right, and consistently going higher and higher. And I'm just finishing up Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. I'm on law number 36, and once I'm done with 48, I mean, I'm going to conquer the world. But the first law in the book is do not outshine your boss.
mm,
Okay.
mm.
My question to you is that as people think about moving up their career and your personal experience, how do you get to your boss's role?
It depends on who you are. It depends on who your boss is.
Yeah.
It depends on the company that you're in. I mean, there's lots of dimensions there. I
Yeah.
think, first of all, my instinctive reaction is I don't think I'll follow that law or I agree to that law, at least in these times. I'm sure there's lots of examples, and there's some truth
Yeah.
there, right? Like
Yeah.
humans don't like to be outshone, right?
Exactly.
But ultimately, I think, look, let me try to answer that one way. Again, going back to if your opportunity is growing 10x to 100x, your boss is also growing
Yeah.
10x. So for you to do a boss's job is just a logical state of being, right? You can still be a boss, but it's like you're kind of like your boss as long as the opportunity went up 10x. So, and even in those situations, what I've also found is there's less insecurities,
Yeah.
right? When people instead of making $1 million, they make 10 or 100 or billion, people tend to become more gregarious. So in many ways, if you have a limited opportunity or an incremental opportunity is when you really have to worry about all these things.
If the pie keeps getting bigger and bigger, you don't have to worry about all the slicing and dicing. Yeah.
That's why I say that, look, frankly, if you're able to make a fork in your path on opportunity, that's why it comes back to that way
Yeah.
sooner. A lot of downstream things become easier.
Yeah, that's a great point actually, about the pie becoming bigger. Never thought of
Yeah.
it in that
Yeah.
way. From a career building standpoint, and related question, how would you split your time in this bigger pie? The pie is becoming bigger, so you obviously have an opportunity, but how much time should you spend managing up, down, and sideways?
I think in general, by the way, when we talk about career management, I think there's a bipolar answer that I think I want to give here, which is at some point you want to be intentional in career management, no question about it. But I don't know if that is the leading indicator, Neelam. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Bezos or somebody has this inputs, outputs. But basically the general thing about what is a leading indicator, what's a lagging indicator. Like if you have great products and a great market and great customer satisfaction, you have great top line revenue, right? A stock
Yeah.
price goes up. So that's a lagging, this is the leading. So I would say that intentional career management is important, but it feels to me like it's more on the lagging side. What is probably more leading, that's why when you think about managing up versus side versus down, that means that you're making that the primary thing. Yeah. However, if you focused more on, and again, it varies by opportunity to opportunity. It's easier said than done, right?
Of course. Yeah.
But predominantly, I think people, even in the worst companies or in the worst situations, people respect a few core dimensions, right? Which is like, are you highly accountable? Say what you do what you say. Second, are you reasonably good to work with? And then third, are you someone that is more genuine about what they're doing? Yes, career is important, but they're generally more concerned about the outcome than the job. Yeah. And that's hard to differentiate. But what I'm saying is that the leading indicator is to let the managing up, down, and sideways come as an after effect of an intentional approach to do better things at what you do, right?
Right.
Like, can I go and source new ideas, even in a normal PM job, right? Can I actually get 5 customers to come inside and have a pitch to my CEO? right? Or somebody like that, right? Basically, do things that surprise people, that go above and beyond what you're supposed to be. And I think that reduces a lot of the, what I would call the natural, not friction, but the natural requirements to kind of be much more intentional of working upwards, sideways, and
I
downwards.
see.
You know what
Got
I
it.
mean?
Yeah. So what you're saying is over deliver, and basically rest of the things will follow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but over
Yeah.
delivery could be, it doesn't have to be on the core project, right? It could be in any set of surprises
Got
where
it.
people are saying, look, this person came and helped me. This person said a good thing. And eventually all those will add up where the system recognizes you as someone that is a little different than the standard. So then you don't have to work extra hard on the standard techniques, if that makes sense.
Yep. Totally makes sense.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in the podcast a couple of times, but like I think Peter Thiel back in the PayPal mafia days, and Keith Rabois talks about this whole barrels and ammunition analogy, where if there are interesting projects, if you can become the barrel in an organization,
Mm.
like people will naturally seek out to you for interesting project that will lead you to interesting work. And you are right, sort of like thinking too much about like sort of, hey, like how should I manage up and should I spend time, it can be all consuming. Just do the right thing, basically be the barrel in an organization, rest will
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah. And also, I think, look, these days, the world has changed, right? Like even 25 years ago, there were 50 companies that mattered in tech.
Yeah, that's
Now
true.
there are like 5,000 companies that matter.
Yeah,
There are all kinds of companies that matter, right? And I think the era has completely changed, in my
yeah,
opinion, where
yeah,
you if you actually give it a shot of being yourself and whatever, all that good stuff for a couple of years, and for some reason it's not doing well, just maybe it's not the right company. It's okay.
yeah,
There's
that's
5,000
true.
opportunities, right? Unlike
Yeah,
Right.
25 years ago, you kind of had to grind it out through at Sun or IBM or something like that, right?
Totally.
very good.
All great
Good.
points.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mohit. So we talked about how to bet on the right horse, how to be top dog. Let's now talk about how to win the race. There is a ton of tribal knowledge in the Silicon Valley around getting zero to initial traction.
Mm.
What we don't hear is a playbook to do this at scale. What are some core principles you've found across all your companies that have helped you build and scale products? They're generating hundreds of millions in dollars in revenue. So, in a nutshell, Act 2 and Act 3 of a growth product, what does
Sure.
it look like?
I think, and it coincidentally, in fact, can speak a little bit beyond the Nutanix thing on both how Google's, or at least GCP, is doing a little
yes,
bit of that, but also how
yes,
even in a not so exciting area like Netscaler, right? There was a variant of
yeah,
that. But
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll talk about Nutanix as an example. So, but what is the common pattern across all three? I think is that whether you're building a smaller company or you're building this in a mid-sized company or whatever it is to always covet a large opportunity. Yeah. Remember, we talked about personal careers,
Mm.
very
yep,
congruent to product growth. Yeah. Because
Correct.
in many ways, product growth, career growth, if you treat your career as a product, the same strategies apply, right? And we all know there are multiple acts and all that usual stuff. The trick, what I found, is to make sure that the activation energy to go from Act 1 to Act 2 is as low as possible. Obviously, you'll have to find reasonably connected arcs, right? So I mean, we can go into those details, but I'm presuming most people know that, look, you want to kind of revolutionize IT. Let me start with compute and storage because that's what runs most of our workloads. And then let me look left and right and then add some data services on top. And then I'm just giving you a simple journey around cloud, right? I mean,
Yeah.
whichever way that people sliced and diced the three arcs of public cloud. I think in the case of Nutanix, think about it, is that the pattern, now whether it was done completely intentionally upfront or over a period of time, was that imagine our ambition and an opportunity being about simplifying how infrastructure is operated. And infrastructure, the scope of infrastructure was not just compute and storage, it was
yeah,
everything that touches an IT admin. Okay, and the definition of an IT admin could be everything from how I run my virtual machines, how I secure it, how I operate my networks, my monitoring, everything, right? It could have been a big part, right? But how do you chunk that? Is you therefore think through a platform approach from day one. But we all know taking a platform approach is extremely dicey because you don't have product market fit, you don't have a compelling thing built, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't do enough to kind of survive from 0 to 50 while you're building towards a billion. Right? And we've seen many examples of that. There are a few examples where that works, but we'll come to that separately. But in most enterprises, that doesn't work, in my opinion. And so, but however, if you felt like you had a platform approach to support the three arcs, but the first arc happened to be your initial insertion or killer app. So in the case of Nutanix, the like I said, the platform was being built to simplify IT operations end to end. But our first admin that we tried to help was the storage admin.
Got
And
it.
that too, a storage admin for virtual desktops. Because the admin for virtual desktops didn't want to go to the storage person all the time, but they needed a lot of compute and storage. They depended on infrastructure. So if you give the power of infrastructure to the virtual desktop user or the admin, then they got their personal infrastructure basically as a silo. And that was fine because it was much easier to use, easier to grow. So that was the first step. But architecturally, the platform was being built to support other silos. So the second arc was, when we go to the branch admin, can we go to then the enterprise admin? Because that allowed you also time to also build features, right? Because as you're building these things, you're also trying to catch up on functionality. Like we didn't have all the functionality that EMC had on day one. So you have to choose wisely where do you start. So those are other important reasons for these arcs. But ultimately, what it allowed us to do was to kind of give us 3 to 4 years to catch up on what I would call the 80-40 rule, which is 40% of the functionality that hit 80% of the EMC base. Okay. And because we sharded it by VDI, then branch, and a few areas that allowed that first arc to prosper. And that was a couple of $1 billion market, right? At least 5-10 billion, if not a few billion. Yeah. But then that allowed us to raise the bar to then go to the next real arc, which is, hey, rather than simplify just compute and storage, everything that's tied to virtualization also needs to be simplified because they're so tightly coupled. Because there's very little difference between a VM and a compute instance or a storage access, right? So that allowed us to kind of increase the scope as R2 to actually simplify virtualization. And then while we were doing that, it was just a matter of time that people said, look, but virtualization, what if you can, instead of virtualizing compute storage or your data center, can I virtualize clouds? That became the journey. And you're talking about 2016, 2017, about the third arc. And that's a very long arc. Sometimes these arcs are also, what I've found is that the first arc is 3 to 4 years. The second arc is 6 to 7 years. The third arc could be 7 to 10 years. Because remember, they become exponentially both bigger, but also harder. That's why it's important to build it as a platform strategy, because you don't want to kind of, take a lot of energy to go from one arc to the other. And many companies that don't do it this way, the best ways that they do it is to acquire, because it takes so much energy to kind of go
which
from
is
arc one to arc two. So
it did, and it's interesting you should mention M&A. Obviously, as you go from that sort of one product to multiple product, because one of the key, like I think there were two key insights, right? One is sort of looking around the corners and understanding where the industry is going to be in few years and ship multiple products on top of the platform, which is to build it sort of organically. Palo Alto's approach obviously has been, since Nikesh, is like, hey, let's acquire and grow, and usually it's a combination of both, which made a lot of sense, by the way. I guess the question for you is that, like, as you go to that scale, when you're sort of growing from, I don't know, $250 million to now, obviously Nutanix is over $1 billion in run rate. Anything on product and people scaling that you should think about? Like, is it just, adding fuel to the fire, just, hire more BD and sales and product people? Or are there like fundamentally different sort of trajectory as you
no,
get there?
every company goes through this. Like Palo Alto, I know, went through this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Went through this. Every company goes through this. Is that I know people have this like oversimplified view, which is every 2 years you calibrate your team and assess whether they're who you would hire if they were interviewing for the next 2 years. Now that sounds a little mercenary, and frankly, you can go. I would caution people to do that too aggressively, just because it changes the dynamics a little bit. But I'm just saying that if people had all the right good intent and all, that's the mindset to apply. But do it in an authentic, transparent way. That'll be the trick, where the team themselves know that we need to do this to put ourselves in the best spot for the next 2 years or the next 4 years. If you did it like in a surreptitious way and you hired recruiters to kind of go keep looking for the next VP of engineering or the next director of product or the next head of sales for regions, then that just breeds insecurities everywhere, right? However, there's a way to kind of do it in a very a creative way, in my opinion, which is you're just saying, look, we just crossed this, but now instead of just being, if I'm just making this up, like if I'm CrowdStrike, if I'm just doing an endpoint company, I finished doing AWS. No. I could actually be way bigger than an endpoint company. And here's my long-term vision beyond being an endpoint company. And to do that, like when I look at like key functions, can those folks actually get us there? But that's a discussion that could be had with the team. Especially when you're successful, is a great time to have that discussion. And the most important thing is to put yourself in that, by the way, because most people, if you are a director of engineering and you're trying to do this, or a director of product and trying to do this with your PMs, you have to put yourself as well, right? As in, are you the right person to lead that to that next level? And most people find it much harder to do, right? So that's in a scaling of arcs or multi-product. One of the things that I found is that one of the biggest issues, again, just like if your arc 1 is doing well, that is your single biggest inhibitor to build arc 2. And that's just not a salesperson hitting quota on old things. Your product person who's so good at arc 1 will always bitch and whine about arc 2's products as to why are we taking resources from arc 1, putting it on arc 2. I mean, everybody knows this, right? And this is where ultimately product leadership, which is the tip of the spear more so than engineering in some ways, have to have that, sort of like step function mentality of thinking about portfolio management and how to expand the portfolio while still not compromising on focus. And that is an art. And people who are able to kind of step back and think that way ultimately are the people that will continue to scale for multiple arcs. Because remember, right, the prior art was like in the 90s, you took 10 years on arc 1. Like take Foundry. They took 10 years to build a world's best, I don't know, whatever they built. It's a combination of load balancing firewall, whatever that thing is, right? And same thing with Checkpoint, maybe, right? So on a single product, you could make a lot of money for 10 years. Whereas in these days, you're talking about arc 2 coming in maybe in the third or fourth year. All right. And also, I think conventional wisdom thinks that your arc 1 is 10 years. Is actually much smaller now because there's lots of people reimagining things, lots of shifts happening and so forth. And so that's the big thing with traditional product managers who've probably been in the 2000s and 90s, is that they're so used to like having a single product. And because it's correct, right, in some ways, which is you have to be singularly focused. And all of these are distractions, right? For what it's worth, I think that is a little bit of an art there of portfolio management that folks who get it and know how to kind of balance things while retaining focus on arc 1, but also doing enough of arc 2 will continue to grow. Whereas those folks who can't do that inevitably get.
Great.
Well said. Yeah.
Really good insights. So in your talks, Sunil, you've often talked about keeping things simple in the product. Now, going back to the arc point, as you travel through these arcs, how do you keep things simple still in your products?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That's actually super hard. And in fact, until like I'll tell you, my journey of really understanding simple came firsthand from my Citrix days when our CEO, Mark Templeton, and he was one of those extreme curiosity learners. And even my Nutanix founder of the years was like that, right? And at least in Mark's case, he had a degree in design before design was cool, right? Whenever that was, right? Industrial design. Now, of course, design degrees are the rave, right? But so he was a natural instinct to design. And when design became the thing in mid 2000s and so forth for enterprise companies, because design in consumer is a little bit natural.
Yeah.
I would argue design in enterprise is way harder in some ways. Yeah. And so therefore, through the lens of sitting beside someone who actually emphasized two things to me. One was the art of simple and the art of storytelling. And I'll tell you how they're related. But because great storytelling is also very simple, right, in many ways. But just on the products being simple or keeping things simple and so forth. So tactically, there are a bunch of things that you should be thinking about. One is many companies, engineering and products do it. Most of product and engineers come from the traditional school of thought of innovation and so forth. The standard 101 is to make UX half PM, okay? And design half PM, right? And people are doing that extensively now. Pretty much all startups do that now.
Yeah.
I'd say one additional thing that I don't see that many folks doing that is, in addition to UX doing half PM, the PMs, at least one of the PMs being an operator, not a product guy. As in, I'll give you an example. Like, we acquired this company called Chronicle.
Yeah.
Both the founders of Chronicle were actually security analysts at Google. They were not security PMs. And there's pros and cons, right? Obviously, there might be certain fundamental things that of building good products that may not have come to, but I can tell you the sort of like signal of doing 10 things out of which 8 out of 10 met the use cases for that particular customer journey and so forth were very high architecturally, and there were a bunch of other trade-offs and product and all that could have been done. So that was the other thing, by the way, of keeping things simple. That's why I'm trying to focus on people part, because ultimately that's what it is that if you have the right cultural fabric to keep thinking that I have to simplify, if it's 10 steps, I have to get it to 5 steps, but you can only do that if there's, out of the 8 to 10 people, they all understand the value. If you're the 1 or 2 designer or PM trying to do that and the engineers don't really get it, they can't empathize with it, it's hard. So that's the biggest thing that I found is any group that has a high degree of empathy for simplification is directly proportional to how effective you are in simplifying the next task. So if you only have 2 out of 10 that really understand why you need to simplify, then your job is that much harder. So that's why one of the things that I would highly recommend, that I tell people all the time, is whenever you're building these product arcs or whichever it is, make sure that it's just not design led. At least a third of your product team needs to be operators. And that changes the dynamics of the input criteria that's coming into your product.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, yeah, like you said, each of these themes can take a podcast in of itself. But we've got a condensed version here, even with an hour. So I'm going to move to hopefully our last question, or last 1 or 2 questions before we go to the rapid fire, Sunil. So obviously, cloud wars are arguably the biggest battles happening in the enterprise right now. What's going to be the winning play in the next 5 years? You're really good at intuition and looking around the corners. What does the 5 year in the cloud wars look like, in your very non-objective opinion?
Well, I mean, look, obviously we are all in the security market, so
Yes.
I'm not saying that I'll be biased, but I'm genuinely, that's one of the reasons why, like, just think about it, right? I have relatively little security background compared to most of you folks, right? And so in fact, when I did the Google thing, it was mostly to kind of work closely with a few people like my managers and so forth.
That's a feature, not a bug, by the way, Sunil.
Yeah, totally.
But there was a reason to choose security versus, say, a few other areas. And again, this is where I try to say, if you optimize for in the cloud wars, look for where the opportunity is sort of most fertile. As in, hey, yeah, could we build a better job with next generation ARM processors? Absolutely, there's going to be a little bit of an arms war there and all. But ultimately, if you put enough resources this way and that way, at least in the next 5 years, right? We're not going to come up with a new chip per se that's going to change mankind, but those kinds of things, right? I think, we could do things more hybrid, we could make things more whatever. But where are things where there's still going to be a lot of churn? Because that's where opportunity is.
I see.
And so clearly, in my opinion, that's one reason why I'm pretty bullish that the world of the world is going to continue to be unsafe for many, many, many years. Doesn't matter, with all the best efforts, right, that we're doing. And, we've seen this now, even in the last year and so forth. So at least in the cloud war, so what I'm hopeful for is I'm looking forward to the clouds actually coming together to compete in security with, when I say with each other, with partners on the top or alongside partners and so forth. But my point is that security as a market is going to have a lot of churn. And in doing so, I think in the cloud that actually takes a step function change in their approach to materially do something in the world of security, I think we'll try to stand out. So that's one area for sure. I think if I look around the corner, that's like, okay, it's a fertile market. Yeah. The second one is, I actually think the 3 clouds that we know of, if you remove productivity app, as in like O365, the 3 clouds don't really have an app per se, right? They haven't reimagined a business process. And I think it's only a matter of time before the surface area increases to include business process reimagination, right? By the three clouds, it has to, right? Because when you think about, like, have you looked at, man, ServiceNow has been around for a long time. Like, it's an awesome company, great sales force, but I don't really think the technology is that great, right? So, and the stack is quite antiquated and so forth. We still have to think through what does it mean to kind of reimagine the CMDB of the future and all that. So I think that's another example of a thematic area where business process reimagination done by a cloud provider is probably at hand in the next 5 years. So anyway, those are two areas where I think there could be more exciting developments on the cloud wars.
So, just related question before we go into the rapid fire. Among the big three, one of them owns the stack from end to end. Do you see that as a leg up compared to the others too, especially on the security side?
You see, I think, yeah, good question. So I think, look, and I'll talk about it from, like, directly answer the question about Google versus Amazon versus Azure, right? So we all know, right? Amazon's on one side, they're doing services and security. It's unclear what their security strategy is and all that. But look, they're a major provider there, and they provide services for their customers on their platform. And everybody has to do something with them, right? Like, just because that's where customers are, so you have to go play there. But it's unclear whether people actually fundamentally trust whether they have a partner strategy or so forth, right? But it's also unclear what their actual strategy is, in my opinion. Now, on the other hand, I think Microsoft actually has done a commendable job of turning what I call a liability into a competency over the last 10 years. Windows was the most hacked OS, probably still is, but right? And they've taken all the work that they've done over the last decade into becoming a security business. They want to be the full stack, Nilima, as you said, and all that good stuff, right? I think Google, what we are trying to do is look, we are number three, and we genuinely believe that there needs to be a reasonable value in choice to our customers. But at the same time, if choice can be coupled with leverage with partners, we just have to choose a few areas that we opine on, and then build them as, like I was giving this example of platform products to which we can get synergies and leverage to our joint customers. So that's how we are thinking about that market as Google, saying that, look, there are a few areas that we feel like we need to play in because we're Google and we have some competencies, but we're going to do it in a way that there's a strong ecosystem. Like EDR is a good example, like firewalls are a good example, right? I mean, these are things that we think that we can do a better job with leverage of partners. But the one thing, though, that I think in our strategy, it goes back to our simple thing is, ultimately, though, if we can create the best of breed with the usability of best of suite, then that provider will win. And right now, with a single stack, you get the best of suite, but you don't get the capability part. With the, obviously, the other extreme, you don't get the operational simplicity. So the art here will be, and I don't know whether we'll do a good job yet, it's to be seen, but the art will be, while we partner and we have a portfolio of products internally and externally, the art is, can we truly simplify customer experiences?
Got it. One of the questions I was going to ask you is that sort of the underlying theme in your not predictions, but your sort of how you see the next 5 years in the cloud wars is that applications and security being an application will sort of really rule and differentiate. But the computer, the infrastructure, just compute, networking, etc., it's going to be by and large a commodity. Do you see any way? So what Apple did with M1 chipset, right? Like completely changed the landscape. Where we thought that like hardware is hardware, like Moore's law have stopped. Is there any opportunity even with quantum computing and other type of technology whereby compute can become quote unquote sexy again, and one of the vendors can, yeah.
You're right on. I actually think the commodity layers by default are where the true generational opportunities are, Ankur, ironically.
Yeah, got it.
Right? Because commodity layers are what is ignored. Like, to your point of computing, is a generational opportunity. It's just that when you ask the question of next 5 years, the answer will be different than 10 years.
That is true.
Right? To me, yes, if you talk about a slightly longer horizon, you're absolutely right. Just what happened with ARM++, you're going to see probably another big variant coming soon.
Yeah.
And quantum obviously has a lot of people have a lot of hopes on quantum. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Clearly, we needed 2 hours.
No.
Ankur,
It's good
and we
stuff.
are
No, thanks for
actually going
keeping
to
it easy. Yeah.
Oh no, it's just great insights. So I'll go to
And Nilima, by
the
the way, he said it was easy because he doesn't know what's coming.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, yeah. It's all good. It's all
All
good.
right. So since you're a product guy, I'm going to ask you some product questions.
Hmm.
Ready, Sunil?
Sure,
So
sure.
with rapid fire, it's simple, easy, yes or no, quick answers. All right,
Yeah,
all
makes
right.
sense.
Here
Makes
we go.
sense.
What's your favorite B2B product?
Favorite B2B product? TensorFlow.
So there's a part B to this. You're now the GM of this product,
Hmm.
and you have to double the revenue in a year. What's your number one go-to-market or product move on TensorFlow?
To me, TensorFlow, the reason I like it is because it's a generational platform capability.
Hmm,
So my number one thing will be to figure out what my initial killer app is, like we talked about, like
got
something
it.
that actually solves a problem materially differently against a well-known budget, right? All the usual characteristics of a good product, but built on TensorFlow.
Next
Um,
killer,
Yeah.
yes, go on.
Sorry, this was not part of the question, Nilim. I didn't mean to steal your thunder. Do you have a killer app for ML? Like, I mean, not for TensorFlow, but
Yeah.
what is going to be the first killer app for ML?
No, I mean, I know. I actually think it's already. Look, man,
It's
I
there.
genuinely think it's already there. Like, you'd be surprised how much of search is powered by that. How much of
Mm,
ads are powered by
Yeah.
that, right? How much of my, Google Photos are powered by that, right? I mean, there's a lot of, I think, things that are seeping in. It's just that they seep in subliminally, Ankur, versus, oh, there is this intelligent device suddenly from this dumb device, right? It's a gradient, in my opinion, where the devices have become intelligent over time. So, I mean, think about it. Tesla, I don't know about whether they use ML or not. It's become an intelligent device, right? We know
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So actually, piggybacking on that question, before I go to my next one,
Yeah.
when do you think true ML will actually start impacting security products? And we know that it's kind of used in some layers, but it's not as good as
Yeah,
its
it's a great
AGI
question.
products.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like this is an example of knowing your limitations, right? I'm not sure I have a good answer there. All I know is that you're correct. Right now, there's a lot of buzzword bingo there, and there's incremental things. My gut tells me that a part of a security product that is driven by ML, we will know when ML has emerged is when 90% of that product efficacy could not have been done without a degree of learning. Like today, right? Any like we talk about ML in security operations, for example. Like that's where a common ML in anomaly detection and so forth. However, there's quite a bit of anomaly detection that you can still do without ML. So that's why it becomes
Mm.
gray as to what was the real value of ML versus non-ML, right? In that area. However, if there was a app that was much more binary, driven from ML in the security, as in 90% of it or whatever was only driven by ML, then I think and if that app became very successful and all, I think people will look back and say, look, that's probably the starting point. So, and I don't know what that app is.
Great.
No.
In the process of developing a major capability for your product, you have only one option: time, people, scope. Which one are you picking?
Easy answer to remove is to scope. So it's between time and people. I would obviously remove time, pick people,
Okay.
right? Because I
Yeah,
think if you can, because in many ways, just to give you some clarity,
yeah.
if you hire the right people, they'll manufacture time for you. Okay.
Yes.
And as in, there are a few people, and we've seen this, like they're 10x, we call it 10x engineers, right? And the reason we call them 10x engineers is not just a capacity thing, but they're also solving for time. That they're able to build a great product in maybe half the time that other people have done, and so forth. Right?
So I think you kind of answered the next question, but I'll ask nonetheless.
Yeah.
You can only build one big feature now in that scope, one that a bunch of customers have asked for, another one where your CEO is asking you to build. Which one are you going to pick?
No, I mean, yeah. So obviously the former, right? I think as in what customers are asking for, right,
Yeah.
is the first choice, right? Look, I actually think that's what I'm trying to say, right? Like normally these tend to be easier to say on paper, hard to operationalize in reality, especially depending on the personality of the CEO and everything else.
Yeah.
But look, ultimately, remember the original discussion that we had about managing upwards, sideways, and all that. It all comes down to where you are in your progression of earning that respect. And so there is no wrong answer, because there may be the right answer is to listen to the CEO, because they may know something in the first year of founding the company, because that's what founders do, right? That's what leaders do, right? Like if you just listen to customers, the famous saying, right? You have faster horse. Because
Yes.
Henry Ford didn't listen, whatever, they built a car, right? The usual analogy comes. So I think there's always going to be,
Yeah.
a few exceptions like that. But I would say that generally, though, obviously, as you get a little bit more, mature and a little bit more self-sufficient and so forth, clearly you need to have conviction, and the conviction needs to show.
And especially the entrepreneur CEO, they have a sense for that. What percent of time did you disagreed and committed with Dheeraj?
About 30% of the time.
Ah, wow. Okay.
Oh
So
yeah.
70% of the time you had your way.
Well, or agreed also, right?
Okay. Okay. Of
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
course.
You know what I mean? There's two
Yeah.
two
Yeah. Yeah.
options. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Next question. You have an opportunity to run products at any company on the planet. Which product role are you picking outside of Google, of course?
I think at my stage in my life, and so personally, I'm just answering personally, I'd optimize for, like, what are the levers, right? A great time for N years, which is basically great time means you need to, really like the people that you're working with, and you need to really like the opportunity, right?
Mm.
Between those two. So that would be my two primary criteria I would apply. Great time equals, great people plus whatever, great opportunity. And a second criteria would be, yeah, there has to be a reasonable outcome. Like you want to, and my definition, at least in Google, the way I think about it is, versus doing it in a small company, is there's a material chance to come from behind in a short period of time to leave a legacy that, man, Google Cloud really, actually, we almost wrote it off 2 years ago. But there were these 12 people that put it on the map. It can't be one person. I mean, Thomas has doing a great job. He's probably 50% of the reason, right? But I'm just saying, there'll probably be 12 people that people recognize as people. They put cloud on the map at Google. And so a similar sort of feeling of leaving a legacy is important for me.
There is no way, Sunil. If Elon Musk said you get the top role at SpaceX, you're declining that role.
No,
There's
no,
no
see,
freaking way.
no. But think about it. No, actually, no. That's so. Let's talk through that for a second, man.
Mm.
Assume that we got the job as president of the United States. Okay, but I mean, I'm just saying, equally big role,
This is
right?
product. Yeah, this was
No,
the
no, I'm
product
just
role
saying,
question.
I'm just saying, CEO of SpaceX, product officer. I think this. I genuinely believe, right? After a certain point, why do you want to mess up your legacy when you know you cannot do a good job? Yeah, you'll probably have a good time for 6 months, 3 months, or whatever. Maybe not even a good time for 2 days. But so I think you have to kind of, it has to be in that plus 20, 30% stretch, right? It has to be, a reasonable stretch, but you know when it's 5x and it's going to break, right? Like SpaceX, I don't even remember my college physics that well, right? So there are some obvious things there that don't work for me to kind of go do SpaceX.
Well, Sunil, you didn't answer the company name though.
No,
The
he
Can
said
you put on
Google. That was a very safe answer. He said Google basically,
Google?
or
Yeah, yeah.
something like Google.
To be honest, I'm focused on that. I'm
Yeah,
focused
Got
on
it.
of
that.
course,
Got
of
it.
course, makes a lot of
Understand.
sense.
Totally. And last question, who should we invite next on the pod?
I would say someone who can blend awesome knowledge, storytelling, all around good capability, but he's already not hit the circuit as often as Dheeraj. Dheeraj has hit the circuit, so he's a good choice. Would actually be Sudesh Nair. So
Okay,
Sudesh
yeah,
was, and I can set it up, but basically he joined Dheeraj and Mohit. I mean, all those guys are good people to talk to, right? But
yeah.
Sudesh joined them pretty early, almost like a lead sales guy, single person, has never led sales before. And then I'll let you, if you guys get him on this thing, you'll know what I mean, right? He can provide a totally different kind of takeaways for these
Okay.
guys.
Absolutely. We're sucker for that kind of knowledge. So totally. Great. Sunil, thank you. That wraps up this episode of Zero to Exit. It's been a pleasure to have you on the pod. We appreciate you taking the time, and best wishes as you help Google Cloud Security reach newer heights.
No, thank you,
Yeah.
Neelman, Ankur. No, this is a great pleasure. I didn't tell you this, but I didn't listen to any of the podcasts because I didn't want to be influenced by how
Yeah.
good people were. But now that it's done, I'm actually, because as I said this before we started, right? I'm quite impressed by folks who are able to do these things out of genuine, you know,
Yeah.
whatever intent, but you're doing it outside of your main thing, and
Yes.
you're doing it in a very intentful way.
Yeah.
So I'm a sucker for listening to podcasts. So I'm looking forward to actually going back and checking on a few of those, by the way.
Yeah,
So
thank you so much, Sunil. Yeah,
Thank you.
wish you best at Google Cloud. Obviously, podcasts aside, as companies, Palo Alto and Google, we have worked together, and you build a incredible machinery. And wishing you best. Thank you so much.
yeah. Thanks, Ankur. Thanks, Nilma. Take
Thank
care.
you,
Thank you,
Kunal.
guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.